During a live interview, a millionaire dismisses his wife's dreams with a condescending laugh, unaware that this moment will set off a chain of events neither of them could have anticipated. As the months unfold, secrets are revealed, ambitions collide, and one of them rises in a way no one expected. The stage lights reflected off the gleaming glass walls of the auditorium, casting a soft, golden hue across the room as the hum of conversations faded to silence. Eleanor Thornton sat on the cream-colored love seat positioned at the center of the stage, her legs crossed elegantly and her posture refined. The soft silk of her navy blue dress clung to her frame with effortless grace, and her hands rested delicately on her lap as if she'd been born for such moments. Beside her, Richard Thornton leaned back casually, his tailored suit clinging to his broad shoulders as he draped an arm lazily along the back of the love seat. His Rolex glinted under the spotlight as he adjusted it, the image of calm, collected power. The interviewer, a woman with sharp features and a disarming smile, shifted slightly in her seat and crossed her legs, notepad in hand. "Richard," she said, her voice smooth as honey, "you've built an empire that most people can only dream of. What would you say has been the driving force behind your success?" Richard smirked, leaning forward just enough to project interest without losing his air of superiority. "Ambition," he replied confidently, "and knowing how to recognize opportunities when they come." "And Eleanor," the interviewer continued, turning her gaze toward Richard's wife, "do you think your role in supporting Richard's vision has played a part in his success?" Eleanor felt the weight of the room shift toward her. She could sense the expectation from the audience, a crowd of business elites, press members, and socialites, all waiting to see if she would play the obedient, supportive wife or offer something unexpected. But before she could answer, Richard chuckled, a low, condescending laugh that echoed louder than it should have. "Her role," he said, shaking his head as if the idea were absurd. "Eleanor's great at managing things at home, making sure everything's in place so I can focus on the bigger picture. But business? That's not exactly her arena." The laughter that followed from the audience wasn't cruel, but it stung nonetheless. Eleanor felt the heat rush to her cheeks, though she maintained her composure. She forced a tight-lipped smile, the kind that masked the swirling storm inside her. Her heart pounded, and for a brief moment, she considered correcting him, reminding the world that she had, in fact, been deeply involved in the early stages of his company. But years of biting her tongue had taught her the art of restraint. "Of course," she said softly, her voice steady. "Richard's success speaks for itself." The interviewer, sensing the tension but unwilling to press further, moved on to the next question, but Eleanor's mind was already elsewhere. She barely heard the rest of the conversation, her thoughts spiraling around the humiliation she had just endured, publicly, at the hands of the man she had devoted her life to. The applause that followed the end of the interview felt distant, hollow, as if it were happening in another world. Backstage, Richard seemed unfazed, scrolling through his phone as they waited for their car to pull around. "You handled that well," he said absent-mindedly, as if her composure had been expected, not appreciated. Eleanor stared at him, her gaze unwavering. "Did you mean what you said back there?" He finally looked up, frowning slightly. "Mean what?" "That my role is to stay out of your way while you handle the important things." Richard shrugged, tucking his phone into his pocket. "It's not personal, Eleanor. It's just the truth. You've always been good at the things I'm not. Keeping things running smoothly, making sure the house doesn't fall apart. That's what makes us a good team." She opened her mouth to argue, but stopped herself. What was the point? He had already made up his mind about her value, and she realized with a sinking feeling that this wasn't new. It had been building for years, quietly eroding the foundation of their relationship while she convinced herself that things would change. Their car arrived, a sleek black sedan driven by one of Richard's chauffeurs. The ride home was silent, save for the occasional ping of notifications on Richard's phone. Eleanor stared out the window, watching the city blur past, a city she had once dreamed of conquering by his side. But tonight, that dream felt further away than ever. When they arrived at their penthouse, Richard immediately loosened his tie and poured himself a glass of scotch. Eleanor followed him into the living room, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. The tension between them was palpable, but Richard seemed oblivious as he sank into the leather armchair and opened his laptop. "I'm heading to bed," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. He waved her off without looking up. "Good night." She stood there for a moment, watching him. The man she had loved, admired, and sacrificed for was now a stranger. A man who laughed at her dreams on national television and didn't think twice about it. She turned and walked to their bedroom, closing the door behind her and leaning against it, her breath shallow. Her reflection in the floor-length mirror across the room caught her attention. She studied herself, the woman who had spent years being everything Richard needed, the woman who had silenced her ambitions for the sake of his. A surge of anger bubbled within her, followed by something stronger, determination. Eleanor crossed the room and sat at her vanity, pulling out an old notebook she hadn't touched in years. Its pages were filled with ideas, business concepts, market research, sketches of products she had once dreamed of developing. She had hidden it away when Richard's company began to take off, telling herself that her time would come later. But later had never arrived. She ran her fingers over the faded ink, her mind racing. The sting of Richard's laughter still burned, but it wasn't defeat she felt. It was fuel. The next morning, Eleanor woke before dawn, slipping out of bed without disturbing Richard. She dressed in comfortable yet professional attire, a fitted blazer, tailored trousers, and a silk blouse, and tied her hair into a sleek ponytail. Grabbing her phone, she scrolled through her contacts until she found the name she was looking for: James Donovan. James had been one of Richard's earliest investors, a man with an eye for potential and a reputation for spotting game-changing ideas. But after a disagreement with Richard about long-term strategy, he had pulled out of the company. Eleanor had always admired his vision, even if Richard hadn't. She hesitated for only a moment before pressing the call button. "Eleanor Thornton," James's voice greeted her after the second ring. "It's been a while." "Yes," she replied, her voice steady. "But I think it's time we changed that." And just like that, the first move had been made. Imagine being in Eleanor's shoes, humiliated in public, only to rise stronger. What would you have done differently in her place? Drop your thoughts in the comments, give this video a like if her story inspires you, and don't forget to subscribe to see how this journey unfolds until the final reveal. The morning sunlight seeped into the penthouse through its towering floor-to-ceiling windows, casting soft, golden streaks across the marble floors. The city outside buzzed to life, but inside the bedroom, Eleanor Thornton moved quietly. Richard still lay asleep, sprawled on his side of the bed, his arm lazily stretched over the edge as if he hadn't a care in the world. His breathing was steady, peaceful, so different from the whirlwind thoughts spinning in Eleanor's mind. She slipped into her tailored black blazer, buttoning it with careful precision, her hands steady despite the storm brewing within her. The heels of her polished leather shoes clicked softly against the floor as she made her way to the kitchen. There, she prepared her coffee the same way she always did. Black, no sugar, a habit formed more out of necessity than preference. Today, though, it tasted different. Bitterness lingered on her tongue, but she didn't flinch. She welcomed it. The bitterness was a reminder of the night before, of Richard's laughter echoing through her mind, of the way he had dismissed her without a second thought. Eleanor picked up her phone and unlocked it, scrolling through her contacts until she reached the name that had once symbolized opportunity but had been forgotten amid her years of silence. James Donovan, a man who had recognized her potential long before Richard had begun treating her like a background player in his success story. James had always been someone she admired, sharp, perceptive, and unapologetically forward-thinking. Years ago, when Richard's company was still gaining traction, James had pitched an idea to diversify their investments into emerging markets. But Richard, driven by immediate results and short-term gains, had rejected it outright, labeling it too cautious. The fallout had been swift, and James had walked away. But Eleanor remembered everything. She remembered the conversations James had with her while Richard was busy charming investors. He had seen something in her that even she had been afraid to admit at the time. A mind capable of strategic planning, someone who could assess risk and reward with precision. And now, she needed that recognition again. Her thumb hovered over the call button. A voice in her head whispered doubts. What if he doesn't remember me? What if he doesn't care anymore? But then, she thought of Richard's smirk, the way he had humiliated her in front of an audience as though she were nothing more than an accessory to his success. That thought was enough to push her past hesitation. She pressed the button. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered, smooth and warm, as if time had never passed. Eleanor Thornton, James said, a hint of surprise coloring his tone. Now that's a name I didn't expect to see on my screen this morning. Eleanor smiled faintly. I suppose life has its surprises. Indeed it does. His voice softened slightly, as though he were leaning back into an armchair, contemplating the weight of her call. It's been, 5 years since we last spoke? How's Richard's empire treating you? The question made her pause. It's treating Richard well enough, she replied carefully, swirling the coffee in her mug. But I think it's time I start carving out something of my own. James hummed thoughtfully on the other end. Now that sounds interesting. I'm listening. They agreed to meet later that afternoon at an upscale cafe downtown, the kind of place where business meetings were conducted discreetly over artisanal pastries and overpriced lattes. Eleanor arrived early, choosing a seat in the corner where the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the bustling city outside. She tapped her fingers against the table, her nerves a mixture of excitement and anxiety. But as the minutes passed, she felt the balance shift. Excitement overtook anxiety, and by the time James walked through the door, she was ready. He was just as she remembered him. Tall, with salt and pepper hair neatly combed back and a tailored navy suit that hinted at understated elegance. His sharp blue eyes scanned the room before landing on her, and a genuine smile spread across his face. Eleanor, he said warmly as he approached the table. You look as poised as ever. And you haven't changed a bit, she replied, standing to greet him with a firm handshake. They settled into their seats, and for the first few minutes, their conversation was light, reminiscing about old times, exchanging pleasantries about the business landscape. But Eleanor had no intention of lingering on nostalgia. She had a purpose, and she intended to make it clear. James, she said, her tone shifting to something more serious. I won't beat around the bush. I called you because I need a partner. Someone who believes in strategic growth, in playing the long game. Someone who knows how to build something that lasts. He leaned back slightly, tapping his fingers against his coffee cup as he studied her. And what exactly are you looking to build? Eleanor pulled out a leather-bound notebook from her bag and slid it across the table. Its pages were filled with neatly organized notes, market research, and detailed projections. James flipped through them, his brow furrowing with concentration. You've been busy, he remarked, clearly impressed. I've had ideas, she admitted, but I let them sit on the shelf for too long. I'm done waiting. He nodded, closing the notebook and resting his hands on it. This isn't just about business, is it? Eleanor's gaze didn't waver. No, it's not. It's about reclaiming something I lost. Richard may have built an empire, but he didn't do it alone. I was there from the beginning, offering ideas, running numbers, and making decisions behind the scenes. But somewhere along the way, I let him take all the credit. That ends now. James chuckled softly, but there was admiration in his eyes. I always knew you had it in you. Richard just couldn't see it. He leaned forward, his tone dropping to something more serious. But I do. Let's make this work. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt a spark of genuine hope. You won't regret this. I know I won't, James replied, his confidence infectious. But be ready, Eleanor. This isn't just about beating Richard at his own game. This is about redefining what success means for you. She smiled, feeling the weight of the moment settle into her chest like a heavy but welcome burden. I'm ready. As they left the cafe, the city continued to move around them, indifferent to the decisions being made inside. But Eleanor knew that by the time she was done, this city would know her name, and not as Richard Thornton's wife, but as someone who had carved her own path. When she returned to the penthouse later that evening, the air was thick with the scent of Richard's cologne. He stood in the living room, loosening his tie as he scrolled through emails on his phone. He barely looked up as she entered. "How was your day?" he asked, his tone casual and different. "Productive," she replied, slipping off her heels and heading toward the bedroom. "Good to hear," Richard murmured, already lost in his work. Eleanor closed the door behind her and leaned against it, her heart pounding. For the first time in years, she didn't feel trapped by the walls of their home. Instead, she felt like she was standing on the edge of something monumental. This time, she wouldn't be waiting for Richard to notice her. She was going to make him notice. Eleanor Thornton stared at the reflection in her vanity mirror, fingers running absently through her hair as memories of the past filtered through her mind. Her bedroom was quiet, save for the faint hum of the city below. Outside, the glow of skyscrapers cast soft shadows across the walls, but Eleanor's gaze was fixed inward, trapped in a reel of moments that had shaped her. How had it come to this? How had she, once brimming with ambition, allowed herself to become an accessory to someone else's success? The answer, she realized, wasn't as simple as Richard's arrogance. It was rooted in years of choices made out of love, loyalty, and a desire to support the man she thought saw her as his equal. The memory that weighed most heavily tonight wasn't Richard's recent laughter during the interview, but a scene from years earlier, back when they were still building the foundation of his company. She remembered the cramped apartment they had lived in when Richard first quit his corporate job to pursue his dream of starting his own financial firm. Their tiny kitchen had doubled as an office, with spreadsheets and notebooks piled on the table alongside half-eaten dinners and coffee-stained mugs. Eleanor had worked tirelessly by his side, crunching numbers, writing emails, and even attending investor meetings when Richard couldn't. Back then, it felt like a partnership. She wasn't just his wife. She was his sounding board, his confidant, the person he trusted with his wildest ideas. They stayed up late most nights, debating business strategies and poring over financial reports. She remembered one particular night when Richard had been on the verge of giving up after an investor backed out of a major deal. "I don't know if I can do this, Eleanor," he had said, his head in his hands. "We're running out of money, and without this investor, we'll be bankrupt within 6 months." Eleanor had knelt in front of him, taking his hands in hers. "We'll figure it out," she had whispered, her voice steady even though her heart had been racing. "I believe in you. I believe in us." And they had figured it out, together. Eleanor had reached out to a family friend, convincing him to invest a modest sum that had kept their business afloat until Richard secured the next round of funding. It had been a turning point, and from there, the company had grown steadily. But as the business expanded, something shifted. Richard began attending meetings alone, brushing off her suggestions with polite but dismissive comments like, "I've got it handled, Eleanor." At first, she convinced herself that he was just trying to protect her from stress. But as the years went on, the dismissals became more frequent, and she found herself on the outside looking in. The breaking point came 2 years ago when she had proposed an idea for a partnership with a technology firm that specialized in predictive analytics. "It could give us a competitive edge," she had said, laying out the research she had spent weeks compiling. But Richard had barely glanced at the report before shaking his head. "This isn't our focus right now," he had said, flipping through emails on his phone. "Let's stick to what we're good at. But if we don't innovate, we'll fall behind," she had argued, her frustration bubbling to the surface. Richard had sighed, setting his phone down long enough to give her a patronizing smile. "Eleanor, I appreciate your input, but I know this business better than anyone. Trust me on this." Those words had stung more than she cared to admit. She had walked away from the conversation feeling small, as though her years of dedication had amounted to nothing. And yet, she stayed. Loyalty had kept her rooted, even when her instincts told her to spread her wings. Now, as she sat in front of the mirror, she realized that loyalty had come at a cost. She had sacrificed her own dreams for the sake of Richard's, and in return, he had taken her for granted. But those days were over. The meeting with James earlier that day had reignited something inside her, a sense of purpose, a reminder that she was capable of more than managing dinner parties and household schedules. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a text from James. "Looking forward to seeing the rest of your ideas tomorrow. Let's make some waves." Eleanor smiled, a flicker of excitement surging through her. She quickly typed a response. "Absolutely. I'll have everything ready." The sound of the bedroom door opening made her turn. Richard stood in the doorway, his tie loosened and his expression tired. "You're still up?" he asked, stepping inside and kicking off his shoes. "Couldn't sleep," she replied, setting her phone down. He sat on the edge of the bed, running a hand through his hair. "Long day at the office," he murmured, as if that explained his absence. Eleanor didn't respond. She watched him for a moment, wondering if he had any idea how far she had already drifted from him. But he was oblivious, just as he had been for years. "Did you see the news about the merger I'm working on?" he asked, leaning back on his elbows. She shook her head. "I've been busy." "Busy with what?" he asked, his tone light but laced with curiosity. "Just some personal projects," she said, careful to keep her voice neutral. He chuckled, as if the idea amused him. "Maybe one day, you'll show me what you're working on." Maybe, she thought, though she knew that by the time he realized the scope of her work, it would be too late. She stood and walked toward the window, the city lights reflecting in her eyes. "Good night, Richard," she said softly, not bothering to wait for his response. The next morning, Eleanor was up before dawn again, her routine now a mix of precision and purpose. She reviewed her notes over breakfast, fine-tuning her strategy before meeting with James and the other potential investors. This wasn't just about proving Richard wrong. It was about proving to herself that she had what it took to succeed on her own terms. As she sipped her coffee, her mind drifted back to another memory, one that had stayed with her for years. It was the night of their 5th wedding anniversary, and Richard had surprised her with dinner at an upscale restaurant. Over dessert, he had told her that he couldn't have built his company without her. "You're my secret weapon," he had said, holding her hand across the table. "I wouldn't be where I am today without you." She had believed him then, but now she saw the truth. She wasn't his secret weapon. She had been his safety net, the person who caught him when he stumbled and let him take the credit when they soared. But that safety net was gone. By noon, she was seated in a private conference room, presenting her ideas to a room full of investors who were captivated by her vision. James sat beside her, nodding approvingly as she spoke with the kind of confidence that came from years of preparation. When the meeting ended, one of the investors approached her, a woman in her early 50s with a commanding presence. "I'm impressed," she said, shaking Eleanor's hand. "You've got something special here." "Thank you," Eleanor replied, her voice steady. "This is just the beginning." And she meant it. As she left the building, the cool afternoon breeze brushed against her skin, carrying with it the scent of possibility. She didn't look back. The warm glow of the desk lamp cast a golden hue across Eleanor Thornton's workspace, illuminating the neatly stacked documents, spreadsheets, and research reports she had compiled over the past few weeks. The once quiet corner of the penthouse, previously reserved for casual reading and reflection, had transformed into the nerve center of a growing plan. One that had taken root in secret but was now stretching towards something far greater. Eleanor sat with her legs crossed, her pen tapping rhythmically against the edge of a leather-bound notebook. Her eyes skimmed the details of a financial projection report, double-checking the calculations before she presented them to James and his team later that day. A soft chime from her laptop drew her attention to the incoming email, another investor expressing interest after their initial meeting. The momentum was building faster than she had anticipated, but she wasn't about to let it overwhelm her. Across the room, the faint hum of the city's morning rush drifted through the half-open window. The sound was comforting, a reminder that the world outside moved forward regardless of who was in control. And for the first time in years, Eleanor felt like she wasn't just observing that movement, she was driving it. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Richard's footsteps echoing down the hallway. She quickly closed the laptop and slid the notebook into her drawer just as he entered the room, dressed in a crisp navy suit that hugged his frame perfectly. His presence filled the room, not just because of his size, but because of the way he carried himself, with the kind of confidence that had once inspired her but now felt more like a barrier. "You're up early again," he remarked, adjusting his cufflinks as he walked toward the kitchen to pour himself a cup of coffee. "What's got you so busy these days?" Eleanor offered him a small smile, leaning back in her chair as though she had nothing to hide. "Just some projects I've been working on," she said casually, taking a sip of her own coffee. Richard smirked, as if the idea of her being busy amused him. "You've been spending a lot of time on those projects," he commented, his tone bordering on dismissive. "Anything I should be worried about?" She laughed lightly, masking the irritation bubbling beneath the surface. "Only if you plan on underestimating me again," Richard chuckled, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Confusion, perhaps, or a twinge of concern. It was brief, gone as quickly as it had appeared, and he brushed it off with a wave of his hand. "I'm heading into the office early," he said, grabbing his briefcase from the counter. "Big day ahead. Samantha and I have a meeting with the board to finalize the merger." Eleanor nodded, her smile never faltering. "Good luck with that." He kissed her cheek absent-mindedly before heading out the door, leaving behind the faint scent of his cologne. As soon as the door closed, Eleanor exhaled, her shoulders relaxing for the first time that morning. She retrieved her notebook from the drawer and reopened her laptop, her fingers moving swiftly across the keyboard as she responded to the latest investor inquiry. There was no time to waste. By mid-morning, she was seated in a sleek conference room at James's office, the walls adorned with minimalist art and large windows that offered a panoramic view of the city skyline. The atmosphere was buzzing with energy, the kind that came from collaboration and shared ambition. Eleanor had always loved this environment, the back and forth of ideas, the excitement of innovation, the satisfaction of solving complex problems. James entered the room, a tablet tucked under his arm and a knowing smile on his face. "I just spoke with another potential investor," he said, taking the seat next to her. "They're very interested in what you're doing. I think they'll be ready to commit once we show them the next phase of the plan." Eleanor nodded, her confidence growing with each passing day. "I'll have the updated financial projections ready by tomorrow. We need to emphasize the long-term benefits. They're not just investing in a product, but in a sustainable vision." "That's exactly the pitch they want to hear," James replied, tapping his fingers against the table. "You're good at this, Eleanor. Better than you give yourself credit for." She smiled, though the compliment stirred something bittersweet within her. She had spent so many years questioning her own worth, wondering if Richard's dismissiveness had been justified. But now, with every step she took, she was proving not only to others but to herself that she had always been capable of more. The meeting lasted for nearly 2 hours, with James and his team dissecting every aspect of the proposal. They discussed marketing strategies, potential risks, and contingency plans, things Richard had often neglected in favor of bold, high-stakes moves. But Eleanor knew that real success wasn't built on flashy presentations or blind confidence. It was built on preparation, patience, and a deep understanding of the market. When the meeting concluded, James walked her to the elevator. "We're on the verge of something big here," he said, his voice filled with optimism. "You've got a natural instinct for this, Eleanor. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." "I won't," she promised, stepping into the elevator. As the doors closed, she felt a surge of determination wash over her. This wasn't just about proving Richard wrong. It was about proving herself right. Back at the penthouse, Eleanor sat by the large window in the living room, her laptop resting on her knees. The afternoon sun streamed through the glass, casting a warm glow over the room. She could hear the faint sounds of the city below, a constant reminder that life moved forward even when people didn't expect it to. She opened a folder labeled Phase 2 and began outlining the next steps for her project. She was meticulous, double-checking every detail and making notes where adjustments were needed. Her phone buzzed with a message from one of the investors. "Impressive presentation today. Looking forward to seeing where this goes." Eleanor smiled, typing a quick response before turning her attention back to her work. The momentum was building, and she wasn't about to slow down. Later that evening, as she prepared dinner, the door opened and Richard walked in, looking exhausted but pleased. He loosened his tie and leaned against the kitchen counter, watching her stir the pot of soup. "The board meeting went well," he said, pouring himself a glass of wine. "Samantha was fantastic. Really nailed the presentation." "That's great," Eleanor replied, her tone polite but detached. He didn't seem to notice her lack of enthusiasm. "We're expecting to close the deal by the end of the month," he continued, taking a sip of his wine. "It's going to be a game changer." Eleanor nodded, focusing on the task at hand. She had no intention of sharing her own progress with him. Not yet. He would find out soon enough, but on her terms, not his. After dinner, as Richard settled into his armchair with his laptop, Eleanor retreated to the bedroom. She closed the door behind her, leaning against it for a moment as she collected her thoughts. The evening air was cool against her skin, and she wrapped herself in a light shawl before sitting down at her desk. She knew that she couldn't keep her work hidden forever. Eventually, Richard would discover what she had been building in the shadows, and when that day came, she wanted to be ready. But for now, she reveled in the secrecy. The quiet satisfaction of knowing that her success was unfolding right under his nose. Eleanor opened her notebook, flipping to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote, Phase 3, the reveal, and with that, she began planning her next move. Richard Thornton strode into the towering glass-walled conference room, his reflection briefly catching his eye in the sleek surface of the door as he adjusted his cufflinks. His navy blue suit, custom-tailored and perfectly pressed, clung to his frame as though it were armor for battle. Samantha Carter followed closely behind him, her sharp heels clicking against the marble floor in rhythmic precision. She carried a folder tucked under her arm, her eyes scanning her tablet as she whispered last-minute reminders. Remember, she said, her voice low and calm. When they bring up long-term risk, pivot to the contingency plan slide. We've got just enough projections to ease their concerns, but don't let them linger on that. Shift the focus back to growth. Richard nodded, the familiar sensation of adrenaline coursing through him. He lived for this. The tension before a major pitch, the chance to command a room full of power brokers who would either nod in approval or shred his ideas apart. Today, he was determined to secure the former. As they entered the conference room, a dozen board members sat around the long mahogany table, their faces carefully composed. Some offered polite nods, others barely looked up from their notes. The tension was palpable, but Richard welcomed it. Pressure, after all, was what separated leaders from the rest. Thank you all for being here, he began, standing at the head of the table with his hands clasped in front of him. His voice was smooth, controlled, every word carefully measured. Today, I'll be walking you through our latest expansion strategy. As you'll see, this plan is aggressive, but that's what we do best. We're not here to play it safe. We're here to dominate. Samantha dimmed the lights and started the presentation, the glow of the projector casting graphs and figures across the room. Richard spoke with practiced ease, guiding the board through each slide as though he were a conductor leading a symphony. His confidence was infectious, or at least it usually was. But today, something felt off. The first sign of trouble came when one of the senior board members, a man with graying hair and a reputation for scrutinizing details, leaned forward and tapped his pen against the table. Richard, he said, interrupting mid-sentence, I'm concerned about the lack of depth in your risk assessment. You're projecting high returns, but what happens if the market fluctuates in ways we don't anticipate? I don't see a strong enough backup plan. Richard resisted the urge to sigh. He had anticipated this question, though he hadn't expected it so early in the presentation. Our flexibility is built into the financing model, he replied smoothly, clicking to the next slide. We've accounted for potential market shifts and can pivot as necessary. The board member frowned, but said nothing further. For a moment, Richard thought he had defused the situation. But then, another voice spoke up. This slide only covers short-term contingencies, said a woman seated near the middle of the table, her sharp gaze fixed on him. What about long-term risks? If growth slows or stalls, do you have a sustainable fallback strategy? Richard's grip on the remote tightened ever so slightly. We're confident in the market's trajectory, he said, his voice a touch firmer. Our research indicates, that's the thing, she interrupted, leaning forward. Confidence is good, but where's the data to support it? You've built this plan on the assumption that the market will remain favorable. But if that changes, you could be looking at significant losses. Samantha jumped in, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. We've factored in those possibilities, she said, her tone crisp and authoritative. And our team is prepared to adapt as needed. But the board wasn't convinced. The questions continued, each one chipping away at Richard's confidence. He tried to redirect the conversation, but the momentum had shifted, and he could feel the room slipping away from him. What should have been a triumphant presentation was unraveling before his eyes. By the time the meeting concluded, Richard was shaking hands with board members whose smiles felt hollow. Promises to revisit the proposal hung in the air like an impending storm, and he knew what those words really meant. They weren't sold. In the hallway, Samantha matched his brisk pace as they made their way to the elevator. They weren't buying it, she muttered under her breath, frustration etched across her face. We need to regroup. Richard loosened his tie, his jaw clenched as the weight of the failed meeting pressed down on him. I don't understand what went wrong, he said, more to himself than to Samantha. We covered everything. Maybe not as thoroughly as we thought, she replied, tapping away on her tablet. I'll schedule a meeting with the team to go over the feedback. We can adjust the strategy and try again. But Richard barely heard her. His mind was racing, replaying the meeting over and over, searching for the moment when he lost control. How had he miscalculated? How had he, the man who prided himself on being 10 steps ahead, fallen short? The elevator doors opened, and they stepped inside. Samantha continued talking, outlining potential adjustments, but Richard's thoughts drifted elsewhere, specifically to Eleanor. For years, she had been the one to spot flaws in his plans before anyone else could. She had a way of seeing risks that weren't obvious, of predicting outcomes he hadn't considered. But he had stopped listening to her. He had convinced himself that he didn't need her insight, that he could handle everything on his own. And now, as he stood in the elevator with the sting of failure fresh in his mind, he couldn't help but wonder if Eleanor would have seen this coming. Across town, Eleanor was seated in a luxurious boardroom of her own, the walls lined with abstract art and the scent of freshly brewed coffee lingering in the air. James Donovan sat to her left, flipping through a stack of documents as she presented the next phase of her project to a group of investors. Unlike Richard's meeting, this one was flowing smoothly. The investors were engaged, nodding along as she explained the long-term sustainability of her plan and the measures she had put in place to mitigate risk. When the presentation ended, one of the investors leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smile on his face. This is exactly the kind of forward-thinking approach we're looking for, he said, shaking Eleanor's hand. You've got our support. As they filed out of the room, James turned to her, his expression filled with pride. You've done it, Eleanor. This deal is going to put you on the map. Eleanor smiled, though her mind was already racing ahead to the next steps. This is just the beginning, she said, her voice steady with determination. Hours later, Richard returned home, the weight of the day's failure etched into every line of his face. He expected Eleanor to be there, waiting with the quiet support she had always provided. But when he stepped inside, the penthouse was eerily quiet. No scent of dinner cooking, no soft hum of background music. Just silence. He loosened his tie further and wandered through the space until he found a note on the kitchen counter. It was written in Eleanor's neat handwriting. Out for the evening. Don't wait up. Richard stared at the note, a strange sensation creeping up his spine. He had wanted space, after all, hadn't he? For the first time, he felt the weight of her absence in a way he couldn't explain. As he stood there in the quiet emptiness of their home, he couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor was slipping away and that he was too late to stop it. The sound of ice clinking against crystal glass broke the heavy silence of the dimly lit living room. Richard Thornton sat slouched in the leather armchair, swirling the amber liquid in his glass as if it could somehow provide him with answers. The glow from the city lights outside reflected faintly off the walls, casting soft shadows that shifted with the passing traffic below. But inside, the penthouse was still, eerily so, as if the very air had been drained of life. He stared at the note Eleanor had left on the kitchen counter hours earlier, the simple words, "Don't wait up," etched into his mind. It wasn't the first time she had gone out without telling him where she was going, but tonight, it felt different. There was something final about it, as though she were preparing him for the inevitable. The weight of the day's failure pressed heavily on his chest. The meeting with the board had been disastrous, and the questions still played on a loop in his head, each one a reminder of how unprepared he had been. For the first time in years, Richard felt as though the ground beneath him was shifting, and he didn't know how to stop it. He took another sip of scotch, the warmth spreading through his chest, dulling the sharp edges of his frustration, but doing little to ease the ache in his gut. His gaze drifted to the framed photo on the mantel, a picture of him and Eleanor taken on their anniversary trip to Paris years ago. She was smiling in the photo, her eyes bright with the kind of joy that had once seemed so effortless. But when had that smile faded? When had she become a fixture in the background of his life, instead of the partner she had once been? With a sigh, Richard set the glass down and rubbed his temples. His thoughts were like a tangled web, each strand leading him back to the same conclusion. He had underestimated her. He had taken her presence, her loyalty, and her brilliance for granted. And now, she was slipping through his fingers. The soft chime of his phone pulled him from his thoughts. He reached for it, hoping, foolishly, that it was Eleanor. But it wasn't. It was Samantha, her name glowing on the screen like a beacon of everything that had gone wrong. Richard. Her voice came through the line, smooth but with a hint of concern. I've been going over the feedback from today's meeting. We need to make some serious adjustments if we're going to salvage this deal. He sighed, leaning back in the chair and pinching the bridge of his nose. I know. He paused, searching for the right words. I missed something, Sam. I didn't see the risks, and now we're paying for it. That's not like you, she said, her tone softening. You're usually the one anticipating every possible outcome. Richard let out a bitter laugh. Yeah, well, maybe I've been too focused on winning to see the cracks in my own strategy. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Do you think Eleanor would have seen them? Samantha's question hung in the air like a challenge, and Richard felt the sting of its truth. I don't know, he admitted, though deep down, he did. Eleanor had always been the one to spot the gaps in his plans, the one who asked the questions he didn't want to hear. But he had stopped listening to her long before she stopped offering advice. After ending the call, Richard stood and paced the room, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor was connected to his failure in more ways than one. Not because she had sabotaged him, but because her absence had created a void he couldn't fill. He had built his success with her by his side, even if he hadn't realized it at the time. And now, without her steady presence, he was adrift. His thoughts turned to the night before the interview. The night he had told her he was taking Samantha to the meeting instead of her. He had expected a reaction, a protest, maybe even an argument. But instead, she had smiled that small, enigmatic smile and said, "If that's what you think is best." He had brushed it off as her usual grace under pressure, but now he realized it had been something else entirely, a signal that she was done fighting for a place in his world. With a renewed sense of urgency, Richard grabbed his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found Eleanor's name. His thumb hovered over the call button, his mind warring with itself. What would he even say? That he was sorry? That he needed her advice? That he had been wrong to dismiss her dreams? He set the phone down without calling, frustration boiling beneath his skin. Apologies wouldn't fix this, not when the damage ran deeper than he had allowed himself to see. Determined to find answers, Richard opened his laptop and began searching through their shared files. He pulled up old project reports, financial forecasts, and presentations, documents Eleanor had worked on years ago when she had still been actively involved in the company. As he scrolled through the spreadsheets, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. Meticulous notes in the margins, written in Eleanor's handwriting. Consider long-term market trends, potential risks in emerging sectors, diversification strategy, revisit later. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. She had been right about all of it. The very risks the board had pointed out today were the same ones she had flagged years ago, but he had ignored her warnings. He had been so consumed with immediate success that he had failed to see the long game she had been trying to play. His heart pounded as he leaned back in his chair, staring at the glowing screen. He thought of the times she had sat quietly in meetings, offering insights that were often brushed aside. He thought of the nights she had stayed up late, running numbers and drafting proposals that he had skimmed over without a second thought. And he thought of the look in her eyes the night of the interview. The moment when he had laughed at her dreams on live television, not realizing the damage he was doing. The weight of it all crashed down on him, and for the first time in a long time, Richard felt something he wasn't used to: regret. The sound of the front door opening startled him, and he quickly closed the laptop. Eleanor's footsteps echoed down the hallway, growing louder as she approached the living room. When she appeared, her expression was calm but guarded, as though she were bracing herself for another dismissal. "You're still up," she said, her tone neutral as she set her purse on the counter. Richard stood, his hands tucked into his pockets to hide their slight tremble. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. Eleanor nodded, but she didn't move closer. The distance between them felt like miles, and Richard hated it. "How was your evening?" he asked, the question sounding hollow even to his own ears. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Productive." The word hit him like a brick. "Eleanor," he said softly, taking a step toward her, "I've been thinking about everything, about us, about the company. I think I made a mistake." Her brow furrowed slightly, but she didn't interrupt. "I took you for granted," he continued, his throat tightening. "I didn't see what you were capable of, and now I'm seeing it everywhere." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, her gaze steady. "What do you want, Richard?" He opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. What did he want? To fix things? To go back to the way they were? Or to finally recognize that Eleanor's success didn't depend on him anymore? "I don't know," he whispered, the admission cutting deeper than he expected. Eleanor nodded, her expression softening ever so slightly. "Then figure it out," she said gently. "Because I already have." With that, she turned and walked toward the bedroom, leaving Richard standing in the dimly lit room, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy fog. He had always been the man with the answers, but tonight, he felt like a man lost in a maze of his own making. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he could find his way out. Richard Thornton sat in his office, the early morning light spilling through the floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the bustling city below. The skyline was painted in shades of gold and crimson, a breathtaking view that had once filled him with pride. Now, it felt like a distant reminder of a world he could no longer control. His fingers drummed against the mahogany desk as he scrolled through emails, each one carrying the weight of bad news wrapped in polite corporate language. Investors were pulling back, one by one, their confidence in him eroding with every unanswered question from the board meeting. He exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair and pinching the bridge of his nose. The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in around him as if they, too, were aware of his crumbling empire. Samantha had already sent him 3 messages that morning, all of them variations of the same theme: damage control. But for once, Richard wasn't interested in spinning the narrative. He needed to understand how things had spiraled so quickly, and how Eleanor had slipped from his grasp without him noticing. He stared at his phone, his finger hovering over her contact. It had become a familiar pattern in recent days, wanting to call her, to bridge the widening gap between them, only to stop short, unsure of what to say. How do you apologize for years of dismissal? For laughing at her dreams in front of an audience? For assuming she would always be there, waiting in the wings? The chime of a new message pulled him from his thoughts. It was from Samantha. "We need to talk about PR strategy. We can't let this get worse." Richard sighed and typed a quick response. "Meet me at noon," but deep down, he knew that PR spin wouldn't solve the problem. The cracks weren't just in the company. They were in him, in the foundation of everything he had built without realizing how much of it rested on Eleanor's unseen contributions. By the time noon arrived, Samantha was already waiting in the conference room, her tablet glowing with data as she paced the floor. Her sleek black blazer and pencil skirt gave her the air of someone who thrived under pressure, but even she looked tense today. "We're losing ground fast," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Investors are spooked, and the media is starting to sniff around. If we don't give them a reason to believe in you again, they'll keep pulling out." Richard sat down at the head of the table, his hands clasped in front of him. "What do you suggest?" Samantha swiped through a series of slides on her tablet, each one detailing potential strategies. "We could launch an aggressive PR campaign," she said. "Highlight your past successes, remind people why they trusted you in the first place. Or we could go after Eleanor's project. find weaknesses, leak them to the press, create doubt about her ability to deliver. The suggestion hit Richard like a punch to the gut. He sat up straighter, his eyes narrowing. "You want me to sabotage my own wife?" Samantha hesitated, then shrugged. "It's not personal. It's business. If her project overshadows yours, you'll lose everything you've built." Richard leaned back, his gaze fixed on the ceiling as he processed her words. There was a time when he might have agreed with her, when he would have done whatever it took to protect his empire, no matter the cost. But things were different now. Eleanor wasn't just some rival threatening his bottom line. She was the woman he had once promised to share everything with, and she had done nothing but rise while he had floundered. "I'm not doing that," he said firmly. Samantha frowned. "Richard, this isn't about loyalty. It's about survival." He shook his head, standing abruptly and pacing the room. "No, I'm not going to tear her down to save myself. If I lose, I'll lose on my own terms." Samantha sighed, clearly frustrated, but she didn't push further. "Then we need another strategy," she said, scrolling through her notes. "Something to shift the narrative back in your favor." But Richard wasn't listening. His mind was already elsewhere, on Eleanor, on the woman he had underestimated for so long. He had built his success on ambition and strategy, but what he lacked now was the one thing Eleanor had in abundance: resilience. And if he was going to rebuild, he needed to face her, not as a competitor, but as someone who could finally admit his mistakes. The decision was made before he even realized it. "I'll handle this," he said, grabbing his jacket. "Cancel my meetings for the afternoon." "Where are you going?" Samantha called after him. "To see Eleanor." The sound of heels clicking against the marble floor echoed through the sleek office building where Eleanor's new headquarters had taken shape. Richard adjusted his tie as he walked toward the reception desk, the unfamiliar surroundings making him feel like an outsider. The receptionist, a young woman with a friendly smile, looked up from her computer. "Mr. Thornton, do you have an appointment?" "No, but I'm hoping she can make time," Richard replied, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. The receptionist made a quick call, then nodded. "She's available. You can head up to the conference room on the top floor." Richard thanked her and stepped into the elevator, the hum of its ascent doing little to calm his nerves. When the doors opened, he was greeted by a modern space filled with floor-to-ceiling windows and minimalist decor. But it wasn't the office that caught his attention. It was Eleanor, standing by the window with a phone pressed to her ear. She wore a tailored white blazer and matching trousers, her hair pulled back into a sleek ponytail. She looked powerful, confident, and every bit the woman he had failed to see before. She ended the call and turned to face him, her expression neutral but curious. "Richard," she said, crossing the room. "This is unexpected." He swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. "Can we talk?" Eleanor gestured to the chairs around the conference table. "Go ahead." They sat across from each other, the table a symbolic divide between them. Richard took a deep breath, his fingers interlacing as he searched for the right words. "I've made a lot of mistakes," he began, his voice quieter than usual. "And I think the biggest one was underestimating you." Eleanor's gaze didn't waver. "You did more than underestimate me. You dismissed me. You made me feel like my dreams weren't worth anything." He nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. "I know, and I'm sorry. I didn't realize how much I relied on you until you weren't there anymore. The board tore me apart yesterday, pointing out flaws you warned me about years ago. I ignored you, and now I'm paying the price." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. "And what do you want from me now, Richard? Validation? Forgiveness?" He shook his head. "I don't expect anything. I just wanted you to know that I see it now. I see you, and I know you don't need me. But I need you to know that I believe in what you're building. You're doing something incredible, and I'm proud of you." For the first time since their conversation began, Eleanor's expression softened. She studied him for a moment before nodding slowly. "Thank you for saying that." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Finally, Eleanor spoke. "I've spent so long trying to prove myself, Richard. Not just to you, but to myself. And I've realized something. I don't need your approval anymore. But I appreciate the apology." Richard exhaled, the tension in his chest easing slightly. I wish I had seen it sooner. Eleanor offered a faint smile. So do I. As Richard stood to leave, he hesitated by the door. If you ever need anything, advice, resources, whatever, you know where to find me? I do, Eleanor replied. He nodded and walked out, the weight of regret still present but tempered by the knowledge that he had finally said what needed to be said. As the elevator doors closed, Richard realized that this wasn't the end. It was a lesson, and for the first time, he was ready to learn from it. Eleanor Thornton stood at the entrance of the grand ballroom, the murmur of anticipation rippling through the air as guests milled about in elegant evening wear. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in warm, golden light, casting reflections across the polished marble floor. This was the night she had worked tirelessly for, the official launch of her company's flagship product. The event was more than just a celebration. It was a statement, a declaration that she had arrived, not as Richard Thornton's wife, but as a force in her own right. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in the familiar faces of investors, media figures, and industry leaders who had gathered to witness what many were already calling a game-changer. Waiters weaved through the crowd with silver trays of champagne flutes, and the hum of conversation buzzed with excitement. Eleanor's tailored black gown hugged her figure perfectly, the understated elegance of the design highlighting her poise and confidence. The subtle sparkle of diamond earrings added a touch of glamour, but it was her presence, calm, collected, and commanding, that truly captivated the room. As she made her way toward the stage, she felt the weight of the moment settle over her. This wasn't just about proving Richard wrong anymore. It was about proving to herself that she could dream, act, and achieve on her own terms. James Donovan greeted her at the base of the stage, his warm smile a steadying force amidst the chaos. "Ready?" he asked, leaning in slightly so his voice could be heard over the chatter. Eleanor nodded, her fingers brushing against the small note card in her hand. More than ready. James gave her a reassuring pat on the back before stepping aside, allowing her to ascend the steps. The spotlight followed her as she took her place behind the podium, the room gradually falling silent as the audience turned their attention toward her. She cleared her throat, the microphone amplifying the subtle sound as she began. Good evening, everyone. First, I'd like to thank you all for being here tonight. This moment is the culmination of years of hard work, not just from me, but from an incredible team of individuals who believed in this vision from the start. A round of polite applause rippled through the crowd, but Eleanor wasn't done. Her gaze swept across the sea of faces, pausing briefly when she spotted Richard standing near the back of the room. He looked different tonight, less like the man who had once laughed at her dreams, and more like someone who had finally come to understand their worth. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment, and something unspoken passed between them before she continued. When I started this journey, there were plenty of people who told me it couldn't be done, she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. They said my ideas were impractical, that the market was too competitive, and that I should stay in my lane. But tonight, standing here in front of all of you, I'm reminded of something my mother once told me. Dreams only die if you stop feeding them. A wave of applause erupted, louder this time, and Eleanor took a brief pause to let the words sink in. She saw James beaming from his spot near the stage, and even some of the more skeptical investors were nodding in approval. But it was Richard's reaction that caught her attention. He wasn't clapping, but his expression held something far more valuable: pride. Not the possessive kind he had displayed during their marriage, but genuine pride in her as an individual. As the applause died down, Eleanor delivered the rest of her speech, highlighting the milestones they had achieved and the innovations her team had brought to life. But as much as this event was about business, it was also deeply personal. When she concluded with a heartfelt thank you, the standing ovation that followed wasn't just validation, it was vindication. After stepping off the stage, she navigated her way through the crowd, shaking hands and accepting congratulations from well-wishers. Reporters were already approaching her for interviews, but she deftly deflected them for the moment. Tonight wasn't about sound bites. It was about savoring the victory she had earned. Near the bar, she finally came face to face with Richard. He was nursing a glass of whiskey, his posture relaxed but his eyes watchful. There was no arrogance in his gaze, no trace of the man who had once dismissed her dreams. Instead, he looked at her as though seeing her for the first time. "Congratulations," he said, his voice soft but sincere. "Thank you," she replied, her tone equally measured. There was a brief pause before Richard continued. "I meant what I said the other day. I'm proud of you, Eleanor. What you've built, it's incredible." She studied him for a moment, searching for any hint of insincerity, but found none. "It wasn't easy," she admitted, "but I guess the best things never are." Richard chuckled, a sound that carried a mix of nostalgia and regret. "I wish I had seen it sooner," he said, echoing the words from their previous conversation. "Maybe things would have been different." "Maybe," Eleanor agreed, though she knew deep down that the path she had taken was the one she was meant to follow. "But we can't change the past. We can only learn from it." He nodded, swirling the whiskey in his glass before setting it down on the bar. "So, what's next for you?" Eleanor smiled, a spark of excitement lighting her eyes. "Expansion. There are international markets I want to explore, partnerships I'm considering." "This is just the beginning," Richard exhaled, a mix of admiration and acceptance. "You're going to do amazing things, Eleanor." "Thank you," she said, her voice softening. "That means a lot." As the conversation dwindled, an awkward but not unwelcome silence settled between them. It was the kind of silence that signaled the end of something, but also the beginning of something new. Richard broke it first, offering a small, almost shy smile. "You've come a long way." "So have you," she replied, surprising him. "Maybe," he murmured, glancing down at his hands. "But I think you've come further." Before either of them could say more, James appeared at Eleanor's side, his presence a reminder of the new world she had built for herself. "We're ready to announce the next phase," he said, gesturing toward the podium. Eleanor nodded, turning back to Richard one last time. "Thank you for coming tonight." "I wouldn't have missed it," he replied. "And Eleanor?" "Yes? Whatever happens, I'll be rooting for you." She smiled, a genuine, warm smile that held no bitterness or regret. "I know." With that, she turned and walked toward the stage, leaving Richard at the bar. He watched her go, the weight of their shared history finally lifting from his shoulders. For the first time in years, he felt a strange sense of peace. He hadn't won her back, but he hadn't come to win her back. He had come to witness her success, and in doing so, he had found something even more valuable: acceptance. As Eleanor took the stage once again, Richard raised his glass in a silent toast, the clinking of crystal lost amidst the applause that filled the room. This wasn't his victory, but it was hers, and that, he realized, was enough. The morning sun streamed through the large windows of Richard Thornton's penthouse, casting a soft glow over the marble floors and high-end furniture. It was the kind of picturesque view that had once reminded him of success, of everything he had built, fought for, and won. But now, the sight felt hollow. He stood by the window, a cup of coffee in his hand, watching the city come alive below. The streets were bustling, the rhythm of life moving forward without waiting for anyone to catch up. It was a reminder that time didn't stop, not even for men like him. The events of the previous night still lingered in his mind. Eleanor's launch had been a resounding success, and even as he had stood in the back of the room, watching her command the stage with elegance and power, he had known that something had shifted permanently. She was no longer the woman he had once dismissed or underestimated. She was a leader, a visionary, someone who had carved out her place in the world without him. Richard set the coffee cup down on the windowsill, the heat seeping into the cool marble surface. The distant hum of the city was interrupted by the sound of his phone buzzing on the kitchen counter. He walked over and picked it up, his brow furrowing when he saw Samantha's name flashing on the screen. He let it ring for a moment before answering. "Morning," he said, his voice rough from lack of sleep. "You're late," Samantha replied, her tone brisk as always. "The board is waiting for you." Richard closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. He had forgotten about the meeting, the latest in a series of damage control sessions designed to reassure investors that his company wasn't on the brink of collapse. But after last night, the idea of sitting through another round of questions and half-hearted solutions felt unbearable. "I'm not coming in today," he said, surprising himself with the decisiveness of his tone. Samantha was silent for a moment. "Richard, this isn't the time to disappear. We need to address the fallout before it gets worse." He rubbed the back of his neck, tension knotting in his muscles. "I know, but today, I need to do something else." Without waiting for her response, he hung up and placed the phone face down on the counter. He couldn't focus on salvaging the company until he figured out what he was truly fighting for. For so long, his identity had been tied to the success of the business, to the image of being the man who could do it all. But that image had cracked, and now he needed to confront what lay beneath it. By mid-morning, Richard found himself standing outside Eleanor's new office building. The sleek, modern design reflected the sunlight, casting shimmering patterns onto the pavement below. He adjusted his tie, a nervous habit he hadn't indulged in for years, and stepped inside. The receptionist greeted him with a polite smile, clearly recognizing him. "Good morning, Mr. Thornton. Are you here to see Mrs. Thornton?" Richard paused at the title, the way it rolled off the receptionist's tongue as though it still belonged to him. "Yes," he said, clearing his throat. "Is she available?" "One moment, please." The receptionist made a quick phone call before nodding. "She'll see you in the executive lounge. Take the elevator to the top floor." Richard thanked her and made his way to the elevator, the soft hum of its ascent amplifying the thoughts swirling in his mind. When the doors opened, he stepped into a spacious, glass-walled lounge with panoramic views of the city. Eleanor stood near a large window, her back to him as she spoke on the phone. She wore a fitted navy blazer over a silk blouse, her posture relaxed yet commanding. He didn't interrupt her, taking a moment to observe the woman she had become. The sunlight reflected off her hair, casting a soft halo around her, and for a brief moment, Richard felt like an intruder in a world that no longer belonged to him. When she ended the call and turned around, her expression shifted slightly, surprise flickering across her face before she composed herself. "Richard," she said, her tone neutral. "I wasn't expecting you." "I know," he admitted, walking toward her. "But I needed to see you." Eleanor gestured to one of the leather armchairs by the coffee table, and they sat facing each other. The room was quiet, save for the distant hum of traffic below. Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he gathered his thoughts. "I don't know where to start," he said finally, his voice softer than usual. "Try the beginning," Eleanor suggested, her gaze steady. He chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "The beginning would take too long. Let's just say I've spent the last few days realizing how wrong I've been. About a lot of things." Eleanor didn't respond immediately, giving him the space to continue. "When we started out, I thought success meant being the one in charge, making all the decisions, taking all the credit," he admitted. "But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what really mattered. I let my ambition blind me to the fact that I wasn't building this alone. You were there, every step of the way, but I never acknowledged that." Her expression softened, but she remained silent. "I've spent the past few nights thinking about all the times you tried to help me see the bigger picture, and I ignored you. The risks you pointed out, the opportunities one dismissed. They're the same things that came back to haunt me during the board meeting." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her hands resting in her lap. "I tried to be your partner, Richard, but you didn't want a partner. You wanted someone who would stay in the background and let you take the spotlight." He nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. "I know, and I'm sorry." Silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. It was a silence filled with the echoes of their shared past, the mistakes they had both made, and the lessons learned. "I didn't come here to ask for forgiveness," Richard said eventually. "I know that's not something I can demand. I just needed you to know that I see it now. Everything you've done, everything you've built, it's incredible. And I'm proud of you." Eleanor's lips parted slightly, as if she were about to speak, but she hesitated. When she finally did, her voice was softer than he had expected. "Thank you, Richard." He exhaled, relief washing over him. "I don't expect things to go back to the way they were. I know you've moved on, and you don't need me to validate what you've accomplished. But I wanted to tell you face to face that I believe in you." Eleanor stood, crossing the room to the window. She stared out at the city for a moment before turning back to face him. "I appreciate that," she said. "But you need to believe in yourself, too. What happened with the company, it doesn't have to define you. You can learn from it." Richard stood as well, his gaze meeting hers. "I'm trying." She smiled faintly, a glimmer of the warmth they had once shared. "That's a start." As they walked toward the elevator, Richard felt a sense of closure settling over him. It wasn't the ending he had imagined, but it was the one he needed. As the elevator doors closed, he looked back at Eleanor one last time, silently thanking her for the lessons, for the mistakes, and for the chance to start again. Outside, the city buzzed with life, and for the first time in a long while, Richard felt like he was ready to be part of it again. The warm breeze swept gently through the outdoor terrace of the high-end cafe, rustling the white linen tablecloths and carrying the faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee and pastries. Eleanor Thornton sat at a corner table, her laptop open, and a steaming cup of espresso resting by her side. She adjusted the wide-brimmed sun hat shielding her face from the late morning sun and took a sip, savoring the rich bitterness on her tongue. The world around her felt calm, an unfamiliar but welcome sensation after months of back-to-back meetings, late-night work sessions, and the intensity of launching her company. She was no longer simply Eleanor Thornton, the former shadow of her husband. Now, she was Eleanor Thornton, the CEO of an emerging powerhouse in the financial sector, a woman whose name carried weight and respect far beyond her connection to Richard. As she reviewed her emails, offers from potential partners poured in, many of them eager to collaborate after the success of her recent launch. She felt a deep sense of fulfillment, but it wasn't just about the financial success. It was about knowing she had built something from the ground up, on her terms. A familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. "Mind if I join you?" Eleanor looked up, momentarily surprised but not displeased to see James Donovan standing by her table. He was dressed in a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, exuding his usual blend of professionalism and charm. She gestured to the empty seat across from her. "Of course." He sat down and removed his sunglasses, placing them on the table. "You've been hard to track down lately." "I've been keeping busy," she replied with a small smile. "But I'm sure you understand how that goes." James chuckled. "Too well. It's a good problem to have, though, isn't it? Success keeping you on your toes." She nodded, closing her laptop and giving him her full attention. "It's still sinking in, honestly. I'm grateful for everything. But part of me keeps wondering when the other shoe will drop." "It won't," James said confidently. "You've built something solid, Eleanor. Even if challenges come your way, you're prepared for them." His words reassured her, but before she could respond, her phone buzzed on the table. The screen lit up with a message from Richard. "Saw your interview on CNBC this morning. You were brilliant. Congrats again." Eleanor stared at the message for a moment, her mind briefly drifting to the events of the past few months. After their conversation at her office, things between her and Richard had settled into an unexpected but comfortable dynamic. He hadn't tried to win her back, nor had he attempted to interfere with her business. Instead, he had taken a step back and let her shine, offering support from a distance. It was the healthiest interaction they had shared in years, and for that, she was grateful. "Everything okay?" James asked, noticing her brief distraction. "Yeah," she said, putting the phone away. "Just Richard checking in." James raised an eyebrow, a hint of curiosity in his gaze. "How are things between you two?" Eleanor leaned back in her chair, considering the question. "Better than I expected, honestly. We've both accepted that we're better off as individuals than as a couple. He's learning to let go, and I'm learning to move forward. That's a big step." "It is," she admitted. "For both of us." Later that evening, Eleanor returned to her penthouse, the one she had moved into after the separation. It was a smaller space compared to the grand home she had shared with Richard, but it felt more like hers. The decor was simple and elegant, with warm tones and personal touches that reflected her newfound independence. She set her bag down and kicked off her heels, savoring the coolness of the wooden floor against her feet. As she moved through the space, her eyes landed on a small stack of mail resting on the kitchen counter. She sifted through it absent-mindedly until a thick, cream-colored envelope caught her attention. The handwriting was familiar. She carefully opened the envelope and pulled out a handwritten letter. The weight of the paper felt significant, and as she unfolded it, Richard's familiar script greeted her. "Eleanor, I've thought about writing this letter for weeks, but I wasn't sure if I had the right words. Maybe I still don't. But there's something about putting pen to paper that feels honest, like it forces you to confront the things you can't say out loud. So here I am, trying to say what I couldn't before. First, I want to thank you, not just for everything you did for me, but for showing me the truth about myself. I built an empire thinking I was invincible, but you were the reason it stood for as long as it did. I didn't see it then, and I regret that more than anything. But I see it now. Watching you these past few months has been one of the most humbling experiences of my life. You've shown me what it means to fight for something real, to trust in your instincts, and to succeed without compromise. You've become the woman I always knew you could be, even when I was too blind to admit it. I won't take up too much of your time with apologies you don't need or promises you don't want. I just wanted you to know that wherever life takes you, I'll always be in your corner, quietly rooting for you. You've earned everything you've built, and I hope you never let anyone make you feel otherwise again. Thank you for teaching me a lesson I didn't know I needed. All the best." Richard. Eleanor sat down at the kitchen island, the letter resting in her lap. A wave of emotions washed over her: gratitude, closure, and a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. This letter wasn't about rekindling what they had lost. It was about acknowledging it, respecting it, and moving forward. She folded the letter neatly and placed it back in the envelope, tucking it into a drawer where she kept mementos of important moments in her life. This, she realized, was one of them. The next morning, Eleanor stood on the balcony of her penthouse, a cup of coffee warming her hands as she watched the sunrise. The city below her was slowly waking up, and with it, a new day full of possibilities. Her phone buzzed with notifications, emails, meeting reminders, and updates from her team. But for the moment, she ignored them. She thought about the journey that had brought her here. The years of being overlooked, the humiliation of that interview, and the fire it had ignited within her. It hadn't been an easy road, but it had been worth every step. She had learned to trust herself, to embrace her ambition, and to let go of the things that no longer served her. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, Eleanor smiled. Her story wasn't over. It was just beginning. She turned away from the view, ready to face whatever came next.